I'm actually going to start just a little bit early, but this is because the recording button somehow got turned off last time, so there wasn't a record of the last class. So I'm going to do sort of a summary for 5 minutes. So, you guys already heard this, so no need to pay attention for about 5. Last time I was sort of mentioning this whole issue of the haole. Closest way I can think of this term would be the way term Anglo is used on the reservations in the mainland. And it's very much in the same context. What you're actually talking about is a value judgment. It's someone that embraces a particular set of values and attitudes. And that's actually what Rohr's book is talking about too. She's talking about the fact that on one hand, folks that have that value set tend to see that Hawaii is a very racist place, which in part is true. Hawaii is a racist place. But they also have a hard time with it because for many of them, they've never been in a situation where they're a minority. Hawaii is one of the few places in the United States where you actually have Asian as your majority population. In fact, it's basically the only place in the United States. And what that means is that folks that consider themselves Anglo-American very rarely in their life experience have actually been in a situation where they're a minority. They might have gone to some place. When I was a kid, we used to, my dad's office was in East Oakland when I was so used to spend time in there. And East Oakland was a totally African-American neighborhood. So if you went there and you were not from that background, you were a minority. But that was a temporary exposure and you went into it and you got out of it. Or if you're a tourist and you go to Mexico or something, that you're a minority. But actually being in a minority situation where you're actually treated like a minority is something that a large part of the Anglo-American population hasn't experienced. Now, I'd say that's changing very rapidly as more and more parts of the United States are starting to demographically become more complex and more diverse. Large parts of the United States, which had no experience of that, are starting to. And this is very true in Oregon, which is really fascinating to watch because that was in many ways sort of, a classic Anglo-American state, despite the fact that it saw itself as being sort of cosmopolitan. And the population has really had an incredibly difficult time dealing with the influx of what they would consider non-Anglos into their mix, and they're not doing a very good job of it. And in part, that's just simply because if you've never grown up in a situation where you have to be careful what you say, if you have to be careful where you go, if you have to be careful about how you react to things. One of the classic situations here is if you're haole, you don't see it as much now as I used to when I was younger. But if you're haole here and you're at somewhere like Don Quixote or something like that, it wasn't uncommon for local Japanese ladies to cut in front of you, figuring you were sort of a tourist or whatever. They just didn't really think about it, but it just wasn't anything that worried them. You go into Chinatown, you still see that sort of attitude. And if you grow up as I did in a minority situation, then it doesn't bother you. Just, you don't get pissed off if that happens to you because that's what being a minority is. You're on the short end of whatever it is and you just suck up and deal with it. And you sort of have the attitude, well, if you didn't like it, then go back somewhere where you're a majority. So that concept of minority is very hard for many Anglo-Americans to handle. And I think one of the reasons you're seeing the huge sort of political discussions and turbulence in American society is in part because of that. That you have a part of the population which in their entire life experience, and especially life experience maybe for an entire family, has never actually been in a situation where they are a minority. And it's something they're not comfortable with. They don't think it's fair. And being a minority is never fair. It's just a result of the power structure of a place. And they don't like it. And they, in many cases, especially with Anglo-Americans, they want to go back to the time when they were a majority. That's not how they phrase it. But the reality is that's what they want. They want a time where their values, their attitudes, and looking and being like them was the norm, and they could be comfortable in the fact that they were the sort of gold standard for how things were done. And they don't like a more complicated world where they have to think about stuff and have to be worried about, what is the normal way of doing stuff. And that's, it's just a part and parcel of change of the dynamics of a very complex society going through an enormous amount of change very quickly. Here in Hawaii, it's different for several reasons. One is haoles as a group have never been a majority part of the population. It's interesting when you see the statistics, sometimes people say, well, haoles are the largest single group here, but they compare them in contrast to, say, Japanese or Filipinos or something like that. But as we'll see today, haoles as a group is at least as diverse of a concept as Asian. Haole is not a concentrated, cohesive thing like, say, Japanese culture, or say Tagalog or Ilocano society or something. So it's sort of interesting what you're comparing as two different types of things. Haole in Hawaii is much closer to the concept of Asian, which in the mainland United States is how most of you folks would be seen. They would not be interested in how you self-identify yourself. They wouldn't care whether you're Chibado or Samoan or Japanese or whatever. They just call you Asian. And in fact, folks that grow up in an Asian American background in places like the West Coast have sort of embraced that as one of the fascinating examples of ethnicity. You find if you go to someplace like San Francisco, a friend of mine actually does these. She makes Asian American coloring books for kids. Not Japanese, not Chinese. She's actually from Hong Kong, but she doesn't make Chinese ones because they didn't sell. Her clientele, which are your successful second, third, fourth generation Asians in California and the West Coast, want Asian American comic books. They want Asian American dolls, which she also makes. They want Asian American stuff. So they've actually taken that larger context that Anglo-American society has put them in as a minority, and they've sort of taken it on. For example, even in film, you find that the guys that complain about Asian representations in film don't talk about Japanese representations, but Asian representations. So this whole issue of the haole has to be taken within the context that it's actually a lot of it's unique to Hawaii by virtue of the weird historical background. But secondly, is also that it's part of a situation that American society in general has suddenly found itself in a situation where it's having to deal with the fact that it had a particular set of values that were basically central to how it's identified itself, which weren't embraced by the majority population necessarily in a lot of places. And now it's becoming a much larger issue. Whereas even 20, 40 years ago, it wasn't, unless you were in border states or places with large, more diverse populations like say New Mexico. So it's interesting to see these changes occurring. I have no idea how they're going to sort out. In many cases, they get very ugly in a lot of societies. And to be honest, in American society, I don't know where it's going, but it's probably not going to be pretty because this stuff involves people giving up power, people giving up control, and they're never going to do that without a fight in one way, shape, or form. So anyways, last time what I went over was this whole issue of the Calvinist Puritans. And the main takeaway to get from all this, and also Rohr's book, because she doesn't really, for some reason, I think she was more interested in the dynamics, so she didn't really get into it. It's important to remember that basically for a large part of the population here, they really didn't have much interaction with what you might call mainstream Anglo-American culture until the territorial period. And in fact, in many cases, still in the 1920s, with the interaction of large amounts of the military and sort of, federal level bureaucrats and stuff like that. Prior to that, a large part of the population here had very little experience with haoles at all, except within the context of the Congregationalist and similar groups who had been institutionalized by then for almost 100 years. So we're not reflective of the general part of the United States. In some ways, we're more reflective of an area like Salem, Massachusetts, in the sense that that particular sort of peculiar brand of Calvinist, Puritan, whatever, became the standard here, even though it wasn't the standard in the mainland United States. I have no idea how many Congregationalist churches you'd find in Northern California, but I bet it's really rare. In fact, I wouldn't be too surprised if you find there's fewer Congregational churches in the whole San Francisco Bay Area with 12 million people than you would in Honolulu. And that's because that group was a big deal here. So it's important to remember that Hawaii is not dealing with the American norm until the territorial period, in fact, fairly late in the territorial period. And that's always important to remember. So it's not American values and attitudes versus Hawaiian values and attitudes, or what later becomes local values and attitudes. It's local / Hawaiian values and attitudes and the Calvinist, Congregationalist, Puritan values and attitudes, which makes for a very different dynamic. So it's sort of something to always keep in play. Okay, so with that, going on to what I was going to talk about today. When you're talking about the groups here in Hawaii that we consider haole, if that term makes you uncomfortable, use the term Anglo. Either one's fine. You have to remember that there's basically sort of arbitrarily broken into 5 groups here. I think the guys over at Hilo back in the 60s, the sociologists that first started looking at this, actually had 7, but I've forgotten what the other ones were. So they sort of play out this way. The first is the Kama'aina elites. Now you have to remember one of the interesting things about elites is elites are not always particularly highly visible. If you look at elites in many, well, especially in American society, since elites are sort of an uncomfortable thing in American society. Americans, given especially the sort of Calvinist or Congregationalist virtues that America tends to espouse nowadays of self-made money, self-made success. Elites, I think, in many cases make Americans sort of uncomfortable because that's usually inherited. So this is a group that sort of has two things. One is they're generally not super high visibility. Secondly, you'll frequently find them in areas where they're somewhat invisible in the sense that they're there, but they have the wealth, the power, and the training, if you would, or the background to be able to keep themselves pretty much invisible. And this is why if you look at really elite neighborhoods in a lot of the United States, it's very hard to find where those neighborhoods are, and it's very hard in any way, shape, or form to get access to them. One of the classic ones here would be Portlock, which is a good example of a very elite neighborhood. There's one in the Big Island, which escapes me right now. I just found it last week and I never even knew about it, which is a good example of that over in the Kona side near Waikoloa, I think, where there's an elite subdivision sort of neighborhood there, which is very, very, high end and very, very invisible. Another example here would actually be the very Malka part of Punch Bowl. When you go towards the Manoa side, you go back in there and all of a sudden you're back in these very expensive, very, very upscale homes. And when you go around Tantalus, for example, Tantalus Drive, and that area is pretty much off the charts in the sense of knowing who's up there and what they're about and such. And so that's typical of elites. So your Kama'aina elite here is not highly visible. Some of them don't live here anymore. Most of the Damons and the Campbells live in the mainland. But those that do live here don't tend to be in highly visible situations. They tend the wealth and the power to basically make themselves buffer zone. So they don't have people, intruding into their existence in ways they don't like. This is one reason why Black Point isn't really an elite neighborhood. It's too visible, it's too accessible. Portlock is a much better example. You try to drive through parts of Portlock and you'll suddenly find private security will be up asking you what you're doing on what technically is sort of a public road. But that's the type of thing that elites do. So this group, you mainly see them when it comes to things that are considered culture. So whether it be the art museum, whether it be music in terms of classical music, ballet, anything like that, traditional sort of Euro-American classical culture. These groups will be around. They won't be necessarily visible, but they'll be the big donors, for example. But you generally won't see them very much. They're not trying to hide themselves. They're just not interested in public display. Now, remember, this is very different than sort of what I call a Kardashian, which is someone who basically makes their living off of being public. So this group is something that actually is common throughout American society. They tend to be pretty low visibility unless you're in particular disciplines. I used to be a classical musician. We used to see them, for example, when you'd open up the opera, say in Seattle or Portland or here. Then all of a sudden they pop out of the woodwork on opening night. In New York, you'd see these on Broadway in the audience. But they're not interested in publicity, and so it's sort of hard to see this group. They're around, they're involved in decision making, but usually not front and center. This is in contrast to the other four groups, all of who are very, very highly visible. The second group I'd call is sort of professional specialists. I'm sorry, I've never come up with a good term for this. This would actually include me in some way, shape, or form. This is people that come over here with a particular set of skills and they move to Hawaii for whatever set of reasons. The classic example is to be someone who's a manager at, say, one of the Target stores. As with all the big retail chains, they rotate those people in and out on a 3 or 5 year basis. So you already you've managed a store, you get sent to run the store, wherever the hell the Target stores are. I guess the one at Ala Moana. And then after 3 or 5 years, you're rotated to another store, maybe promoted too. And this is typical what I call the professional specialist. They're the folks that are either brought in or move here having a particular set of skills, and they're basically taking a job here. This in many ways sort of fits, of course, the classic mainland idea of educational success. People that have the educational success and get paid decent money and have then the mobility to go to live in other places using that set of skills they've acquired. So in some ways, they're almost the personification of the American, Calvinist value system. This group does not marry into the Kama'aina. They generally have no interaction with the Kama'aina. So they're an entirely separate group. In many ways, they are, as I mentioned, with those educational things that the Calvinists, put into the educational system, they're the walking, talking examples of that. Now, one of the other aspects that makes this group sort of interesting is they tend to be very aware of the fact that they are that walking, talking example of that. So they're very big on individualism. They're very big on, you know, educational expertise or knowledge. And oftentimes that then ties into having something to say. This is a group that tends to be very visible on media, either on you know, self-posted media, or also within media in the sense of you know, causes. So if you're looking at like the Lonnie Kai issue or something like that, this group. Yeah. Yes. So Julian's asking me who are the Kamai elite. That's the ones that married into the generally to the Adi. So the Kamai are a combination of, basically think of the New Englanders marrying into the chiefly families. But yes, that's who those folks are. Yeah. So in that context, again, so the professional specialists tend to be highly visible when it comes to causes. If you see, you know, a news report or civil beats or, you know, something, or even, you know, blogging posting with some sort of political issue or social issue, in many cases, you'll find that the people that are most comfortable in the front of the camera and most comfortable saying something will be members of this group. And in part, that's because in the American educational system, if you're not willing to stand up and, you know, sort of put your ass on the line, you're not going to get ahead. So they've had, in many ways, probably more experience, and they're probably more comfortable with the idea of making noise, you know, in the classic sense. So they tend to be sort of disproportionately visible when it comes to issues, whether it be, you know, for example, Greenpeace is a good example. So professional specialists, universities, of course, are full of them. But you're also going to find them in areas like IT and stuff. And again, for that population, they frequently see the skill set and what they're interested in as being more central to where they are. So this is a population where many of these folks will be here for a while, then they'll move somewhere else. UH faculty, for example, I've shown on the last, but UH faculty tend to stay there for about, you know, 5 or 7 years, and they get a better gig somewhere else and off they go, because what they're interested in is being a biologist or being a geologist or something like that. Where they go really isn't as important as the research they're doing or whatever their skill set is. That's real typical of this group. So they don't tend to necessarily have particularly close ties to Hawaii in the sense of the folks here. And also because of their skill set and the importance of their career path or whatever it is they know, they're not necessarily particularly big on social skills in the sense of building a strong social network, because they see themselves as, I don't know if you'd want to, yeah, migrant would be a good term as any. They're sort of what you might call intellectual or migrants. They're skill migrants. Second group would be the military. And it's important to remember there's 2 groups of military. Oftentimes people here think of the one, which is active duty military. But there's actually a second group, which is really interesting. So let me go through the second group first. The second group, and you bump into a fair number of them. I'm most familiar, for some reason I've seen always be bumping into ex-chief petty officers. What you find is there's a very large number of folks who are in the military, what used to be called lifers, 16, 20 years and up. Who after they've been, you know, around places, in many cases they've usually spent at least 1 tour of duty here, but they've also been in any number of other parts of the world. You tend to see a fairly, sort of a disproportionately large number of that particular population. When they do retire, they retire here to Hawaii. This group is generally really low visibility. They're hard to notice. They're generally not making a lot of noise about it. Of course, they don't look particularly military in many cases. You're generally going to find out about when you actually know them, or else you suddenly realize their skill and expertise in particular things just makes them totally out of whack with the normal population. A chief petty officer, for example, knows a hell of a lot more about boats than just about anyone else here. So what you find is this group is here, and they're interesting because they're selectively choosing to stay in Hawaii. So this is a group that selectively chooses Hawaii as an area that's most comfortable. And when you talk to them, a lot of what they really like here is the fact that it's very cosmopolitan, with groups that oftentimes they're familiar with. So this group is really interesting because they've chosen to stay here, and they generally, you know, will be here forever until they pass away. So this group is interesting because of what it is. These folks generally did not have, they were not born and raised here in Hawaii, so they're from somewhere else is where they're born and raised. But in many ways, you could argue their adult life was largely the military for a number of years. So there's large numbers of this population. Officer Corps, I don't know. I've never seen a study done of the Officer Corps, and I've not, You see some of them here, but I don't think they have the disproportionately large population here, would be my guess. I could be wrong. The second group is the really visible group. This is your new group. And the interesting thing about Hawaii is this again goes back to these mainland stereotypes that we're talking about last time or last week, sometime, I don't know, sometime in the past, that you have these stereotypes of Hawaii. When you're in the military system, the first thing you do is you go through boot camp, which basically inculcates you into the military logic. Part of that process is to make you from a civilian into someone in the military, which is a major mindset change, which has been going on. Boot camps have been going on for over 2,000 years. The Romans and they used to have boot camps back, 0 AD. So boot camps have been around. They're typical of all militaries, and they've been around way longer than the United States. So the American military boot camp is nothing different. But what it does, it turns civilians into members of the military. You then go through specialist training. But one of the key things about military training is one of the main things the military training does is develops loyalty. It develops loyalty towards the group, i.e. the branch of the military. It involves developing loyalty towards your unit, the platoon or whatever it is, the group that you're working in. And that's a huge part of the military because the military couldn't function if it didn't develop that loyalty, sort of pattern. And usually the way that you do that in the military is you go through a series of in-between situations. In fact, that's what boot camp is. You take people who are civilians, you shave their head, you remove everything that reminds them of their background, you put them through a set of, sort of weirdly mannered tortures and stressors, and then by the time it's done, you have this in this liminal, what we call liminal state, where you're not a civilian, you're not in the military, and then you get through that when you pass through boot camp and you're now in the military. And one of the key aspects of that is to make it very clear to folks that are going through this process that being in the military makes you unique and different from folks that have never done it. So the military, especially with folks that are first getting into the military, is really, really big on the fact that this is unique and different and you're special. And that's a big part of the initial training. And that's true of any military. Now, what you find is because of the stereotypes of Hawaii, is it's very common for folks in the military who have just finished basic training, got their specialist training, when they're asked for the first duty assignments of where they're going to actually be, they will request Hawaii. Especially true with the Navy and the Army. The Marines, I'm not too sure about. I've never seen a study on that. And then what you find that's really interesting, though, is that when they get here, within 9 months to a year, a fairly large proportion of those folks ask to be sent to a different station somewhere. They've come to Hawaii. They don't like being in Hawaii. They feel Hawaii is very racist. It's very anti-military. They're getting dissed on all the time. People trying to pick fights with them. They want out. And so what you find is the military, in the sense of people in the military, and by this I'm specifically talking about new military, who have the option of coming here as a duty station, frequently do not find that it fits anywhere near their stereotypes. And in doing so, they find that they have a really hard time. And I'd say that they actually have two assimilation problems. For a lot of them, they really don't have a lot of life experiences as a minority somewhere. So even though they might be in a minority situation, they might be, for example, Black and in Detroit, but it's a very good chance that the neighborhood they live in is a Black neighborhood. So their actual dealing with a lot of sort of day-to-day irritations of being a minority is somewhat less. Now they face some of that in the military, but the military is generally putting so much stress on people that's, that's sort of a minor factor. They get here and all of a sudden, bawang. And they're suddenly treated in a very negative way and they don't like it and they legitimately get sort of pissed off about it. For folks that come from an Anglo-American background, even more so, because they might have never experienced, anything really different, and especially any place that doesn't see their value system as necessarily being by definition the best or the only. And on top of that, you have to remember that you have a group of people coming in here, especially the new ones, who have just gone through a set of training which makes them feel special. They've got an attitude, sort of chip on their shoulder in many cases, about being special and different. They've done something other people haven't. So when they go somewhere, they expect to be treated with some respect and, I've done something you haven't done, so, at least, cut me some slack or, be impressed with that. And when they don't get it, they're not happy about it. And the reason this is really interesting is what you get is the new folks in the military that come over here don't like Hawaii, in large part. In part, this is because the military has never done anything to prepare them for it. Years and years ago, my company was involved trying to do a project with the Navy to actually do training for new personnel and their dependents coming to Hawaii. And the whole thing floundered after about 3 months because the commanders in the base wouldn't sign off on it. So most of the military units that come over here, they come to Hawaii with no knowledge that this place is different than where they're from. And that's not unique. A lot of places they go to would be different, but they have no, they're not given any training. They're sort of dumped here. And of course, military bases are odd places because military bases are sort of little bubbles of sort of you might call military / Anglo-American values and attitudes. So it makes off the base really, really sort of radically different than on the base. So the military aren't giving any idea that there's anything they should deal with. They're not giving any idea that they're a minority here. They're not giving any idea that people might have a fairly strong reaction towards them. And so they're just sort of, they're just blindsided. But it says something really fascinating. This group is generally very unhappy with Hawaii in a lot of cases, and legitimately so. But if I were them, I'd also be really unhappy at a military, which absolutely does nothing to prepare them for life here. But then you find that the folks that have had life experience in the military or your retirees NCOs actually like Hawaii. And it's one of the interesting puzzles I've never seen a particularly good study done, which is basically why you have the same thing, military service, these two entirely different populations with entirely different views of exactly the same place, and they're dealing with exactly the same people. And it's an intriguing discussion, but the main part here is just the fact that it shows again just how complex this idea of haole is. And especially if you're looking from a behavioral standpoint, you have to remember the large number of folks in the military that are new members are not wholly in the mainland sense of being racist, in the sense of being white. They might be either Latinos, they might be African American, they might be any number of things. But for the population here, if they've got the haircut, if they've got the dress, they've got the attitude, they're going to be put in the same package. And that's something that, not surprising, they have a really hard time with. I know because two of the guys that have a boat just down from my boat are military, and they're over here. Actually, one of them's on his third tour here. He actually likes Hawaii, but the other guy's only been here for about 9 months, and he hates this place. And everything he says just fits that whole discussion. In fact, I'm sort of using him as my case model right for this one. So that's 3 of the groups. Group number 4 would be tourist. This has become a really complex thing in the last 15, 20 years. It used to be that tourists were really simple. Back when I arrived in the mid-70s, tourists were just people that came in bulk on airplanes, got on a Roberts bus to Waikiki, or if you're on Maui, to Kaanapali, stayed for 3 to 4 days, had cameras hanging from their neck, or a package group of a nuclear family, and would then stay and do whatever they were going to do and go home all sunburned and happy campers. And that was the classic short-term traditional tourist. It was really easy to deal with those people. If you were an ABC store, if you were Roberts Buses or something like that, or Polynesian Cultural Center or anything, because they came over here, they had real, clear expectations. They wanted to see the same things. They wanted to do the same things. So it's just a matter on Tuesday, you pick up a group. On Wednesday, you pick up a group. On Thursday, you pick up a group. And your big problem was bothering to remember anyone's name. Okay. Because they just literally they went by you like a conveyor belt or an escalator. And they just started, you just pulling money out of their wallet as they go by, and then off they go. So there was basically no interaction taking place. Now, this is the group that had the very strong set of stereotypes that were very unsophisticated and very simplistic about Hawaii. And so that population was a population which tended to reinforce the mainland or sort of, global stereotypes of, for example, of Hawaiians and what is Hawaiian, the idea of aloha, drinking coconut milk out of a coconut. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. That's your classic tourist. By the 1990s, that group was starting to get supplanted by another group. And the second group is the real complex one, because that's the group that causes a lot of stress here in Hawaii, and that's part-time residents. These are folks that originally came over, especially with timeshares in the 1980s, 1990s, but this escalated by the 2000s, with folks that basically actually purchase a place here. Traditionally in timeshares, which have never made any sense to me from a financial standpoint, but we'll say that that Noah has got a timeshare. He actually buys, I don't think Noah would do this, I think he's smarter than this, but he would actually buy an apartment for a week. Okay, so this is what you do at Aulani, at Disney properties. You actually buy a unit, but for a specified amount of time. So he buys a unit for the week of, was the 9/27 to 10/3 or something like that. So he buys it for the first week in August or first week in October, and he owes it for that period. So he actually pays taxes on Sunday or whatever. He actually bought it. Now, he doesn't own it the week before, the week after, that's someone else. This is what they call timeshare. Time being finite time, and you actually buy it, but you actually share the unit with a bunch of other owners, sort of owner investors. And if he's not going to use it, you either trade that time with someone else who's got a timeshare in someplace else like Cozumel, or what you do is you go back to the company that sold you this thing and you actually have them rent out your unit for the week you're not using it, and you cut the fee that they're charging. In other words, whatever someone's paying to rent that place for a week, you split that with the development company, and that's, so no one makes some money if he's not going to use his unit. That's the first group of part-time residents. This was a huge thing in the 70s and 80s. If you ever go to Kihei and Maui, all those older high-rises on the Makai side of the front road, those are all timeshares that were built largely for Canadian investors in the 1970s. And they've gone through a lot of hard times. Mahine up the coast and West Maui, same thing. Now that another group starts to show up around 2000, 2005. And this is a group that basically comes in and buys a place. So rather than buying a place for a week like Noah did, we'll say that McKenna or someone actually goes and she buys a house. So they go into someplace like Kaimuki and actually come with a suitcase of money, just punk. This hypothetical, since Chaminade students don't have suitcases of money. You guys didn't have suitcases of Monopoly money. But basically, in that situation, you're buying the place. What you then do is sort of different. And this is a huge thing, for example, in my area of Maui and upcountry Kula, is rather than renting it out, in many cases you don't. In many cases, you just let it sit. You have someone maintain the property when you're not using it. But we'll say that, if you have a place on, well, I don't know why it'd be in Kaimuki, but if you have a place in Kaimuki, what you do is you live in some place like Denver, Colorado, so when it gets the middle of winter and it's freezing over there, you spend a month or two in your house in Hawaii. And then you go back to your mainland residence. So these are folks that basically are second or third home places. Very different than the timeshare. Much larger investment in money, a lot more commitment because now they own a whole property. So they've got all the taxes and other complex things like this. When Airbnb started up in the last 10 years, this is the group that jumps into the Airbnb industry. So they take part of that house they own and they piece it out and they rent out part of the house to the Airbnb business. And in that way, provide revenue streams for the time they're not in the house. So this is the part-time residents. Now, these are radically different than tourists for a very simple reason. Tourists don't have any investment in Hawaii. They're coming over here. It's just like us going to Vegas. Go there, spend some time screwing around the Bellagio, blow some cash and come back poor with some silly stories to tell. That's a tourist. Part-time residents actually have a money investment in Hawaii. They can get pretty aggro about the fact that they've spent time and money, and in many cases more money than a lot of the local population can afford, on a place. It's generally not their first residence, usually their second or their third residence. And they see these as financial investments. Now, this is the group that I think I mentioned before. It tends to be sort of a complex group here because their relationship with Hawaii is very much a financial one. They have very strong stereotypes about the environmental conditions that make Hawaii attractive. The quote beautiful climate, the lovely beaches and stuff like that. In other words, the physical aspects of Hawaii are a major part of the decision making they have when they buy a place. And there's tons of shows on like Home and Garden TV. I can't remember what those channels are that shows those things where they actually have a whole show that does nothing. I think it's called Maui House Hunters. If you go back on YouTube, I'm sure they got back episodes where they actually had this on, on global TV was, buying homes on Maui. And that's this group you're talking about. So what you get is the part-time residents see themselves as part of the situation here. In many ways, this group, one of the interesting things about them is they get really, really pissed off if you call them a tourist. Because their attitude is they're not a tourist. They spend a lot of time and money to buy a place here. And in their view, that commits them to Hawaii. Now, in many cases, or the majority of cases, this place here is actually bought as an investment. So if there was a better deal somewhere else, they'd sell the piece here in a second, and boom, they'd be off somewhere else. So I don't see Hawaii as a permanent full-time residence. This makes them very different than the military NCO retirees, by the way. Having said that, they tend to get very upset if there's any sort of imposition on the way that they want things to be here. The huge majority of this population traditionally, till say 5 or 7 years ago, was Anglo-American. For some reason, we had a huge part of the market was from Colorado. I'm not sure what that was about, but that was certainly true around Waimea Town on the Big Island and in Kula and Maui. There were just tons of folks from there. Kauai had, and on a whole, there was a large population from New York State. I have no idea. I'm not sure why these populations end up on parts of different islands, but they vary. So from one part of one island to another part of an island, you'll see different folks from parts of the mainland will tend to move there in sort of clusters. And so what you find is this become an enormous issue. These folks are willing to pay large sums of money for places. In fact, they're willing to pay huge sums of money for places because they see them as investments, which means that they assume a year, 5 years down the road, they can sell them and make even more money. This term is called flipping, if you ever get familiar with the idea of selling houses. So the relationship with Hawaii is a very cash one in many cases. They have very low tolerance with being treated as a minority. In fact, they have no tolerance for it. They're not particularly interested in local culture in the sense of local ethnic social values. They're not interested in a learning curve because they're only here for part of the year. Their attitude is, and generally because they're upper middle class or upper classes, they should be treated with a fair amount of respect and nicely because one, that's their stereotype of Hawaii, the idea of aloha. But also secondly, the fact is since they're in the upper tiers economically, money gives you status, and status means that people are supposed to treat you with respect. So this group tends to have a really hard time with being treated as a minority. In fact, they will not accept it. And they're the ones that are very prone to suing people about it or making a huge amount of stink on social media about this. This has become a huge pushback as they move into some areas, Lanikai being a perfect case in point, in really large numbers. I used to live down in Kahala, and that area is just, I'd say about every third or fourth house is a part-time resident. So what you get is those populations tend to be clustered in very particular areas. They tend to be your higher end areas, the better investment zones. And it tends to make a real sort of weird dynamic when, you know, you go around maybe during Christmas or something, or even say Halloween, and you find that maybe a third of the houses are literally the lights are turned off because there hasn't been anyone there, and there won't be anyone there till maybe for a couple of weeks in January. So this is a very intriguing group. This has become even more complex in the last 7 or 10 years. Because what you find is this is being supplanted, well, not necessarily supplanted, but added to, probably additively, with folks from Asia. This would be, I can't remember if it's called Park Place or whatever. There's that condo development on the Makai side of Ala Moana Center, facing Ala Moana Beach Park. A large portion of the folks that bought into that are actually Asians, but again, it's not their primary residence, it's a second residence. A lot of the original development, Kaka'ako, was intended for this part-time resident population. It's turned out a little different, which we'll see later is sort of interesting. But it was intended for that group. Places like Trump Tower were entirely intended. The Ritz-Carlton down in Waikiki was intended specifically for part-time residents. So a lot of Waikiki, for example, is part-time resident groups, which is why you can see places that are completely full, and yet there doesn't seem to be a lot of people around there. This is very typical now in the Hawaiian Islands. So what you find is traditional tourists in many cases have been supplanted by an entirely different group that has a major economic investment here, but not necessarily a major social investment. Last group is retirees. Retirees, but here we're not talking about local retirees, we're talking about folks that retire here. This has gone through a bunch of cycles. In the 70s and 80s, this started to be an issue. If you go around the art museum, the Academy of Arts in Waikiki, right above Thomas Square, a lot of the high rises right around that, I'm not sure particularly why, were intended specifically for mainland retirees that wanted to move to Hawaii. One of the ways you can oftentimes tell is I've got some serious security systems set up in front. I'm not sure, it's been ages since I've been down there, but it used to be the Safeways there on Veritania was sort of interesting because you'd see a lot of retirees there that come from the mainland and were very obviously from the mainland, interacting with the locals that work there and the other populations there. I'm not sure how that dynamic's changed. I don't live in that part of town anymore, so I don't see it. It's not worth the trouble of observing, going there just to check it out. But retirees have went through a phase then in the 80s and 90s where they retired to other places, say Scottsdale, Arizona. In the last 10 years, but especially the last 6 or 7 years, there's been a huge influx of retirees moving to here from other places. Again, moving out of Arizona, moving out of Florida, or moving out of places like New York. because their stereotype of the mainland United States has changed. In a lot of cases, retirees are deathly afraid of the way their world is turned into on the mainland. They see it as very scary. They see it as very unsafe. It's very threatening. And probably most importantly is they don't see the values and attitudes that reflect their background as being the norm in the community they find themselves in. Now you have to remember retirees on the mainland could get pretty surreal. I remember growing up in California that we actually had a house near a retirement town. It was a whole village, and I believe it was like maybe 7,000 people that lived in a whole small town that was nothing but retirees, which was seriously creepy. Would have made a great TV show. In fact, maybe it was, I don't know. But there were a bunch of those. They were called leisure worlds, is some really creepy term, which sort of sounds like real sort of a mind mesh creepy thing. Anyways, and so what you get is these retirement communities, huge things in places like Florida, where you get basically retirement towns. Fort Lauderdale's famous for this. So what you get is the folks living there moved down there from wherever they came from originally, with the idea that one, it would be warm, the climate would be more something they were more comfortable with. But the main thing was they wouldn't. An attitude in American society is when you retire, you shouldn't have to sort of socially effort yourself anymore. You should be able to get rewarded for all the years that you spent working. So you can sort of veg out, I guess, socially. And retirees thought they could do that. But what's happened is a lot of the mainland, as they watch the media, they listen to social blogs and all the other stuff that they deal with, especially Facebook, and they're become firmly convinced that their neighborhood has become a den of corruption, death, destruction, and they're going to get mugged the minute they walk outside of their unit. So in that context, they try to find a place that they consider safer, friendlier, and more conducive to getting really old. And what's happened is Hawaii has popped back up on the radar as being the place to do that. This group isn't quite the same as part-time residents because retirees are planning on staying here. The only reason they leave is because they get scared. But they're one of the major new groups showing up, especially on West Oahu. So when you're looking at retirees, they're an interesting group because, like the part-time residents, it's mainly the climate and the stereotypes of Hawaii that attract them. But again, they're not interested in social integration. If you're in your 80s and you worked for 40 or 50 years and you're now going to retire to Hawaii, you're not interested in learning local culture. You're interested in sort of wandering around and doing your own thing and having a perfect climate and having people that are friendly and, and give you mango off a tree or something like that. In other words, you've seen all the stereotypes and stereotypes. Maybe you came over here as a tourist and now you want to live them forever or for the rest of your life. And so retirees are a real complicated group. They're very difficult to work with. They're not a group which is open to negotiation. So they're a very complicated group. But if you notice, the thing that you get here is a really wide range of diversity between all these 5 groups in terms of, 1, how integrated they are with Hawaii, 2, how integrated they are with Hawaii culturally, and a level of sophistication, a level of commitment to actually finding out about things or paying attention when people are saying something. Or the situation with locals here is paying attention when people don't say something. And also sort of a traditional attitude a lot of these groups have, especially the last 2, with, if I spend this X amount of money, I've earned the right to be treated in such and such a way. This is a big thing with tourists in all its forms and with retirees. If someone's paid $1 million to own a condo unit in a retiree structure in Kapolei, they expect to be treated with respect and stuff like that because they put the money down. And they expect that respect not only from the folks that work in that complex, but also if they go to the food land or if they go to the CVS Longs or something like that, they expect everyone they bump into is supposed to treat them with respect. And in some cases, you'll actually find that when you actually talk to them, they come here because they don't get that on the mainland. And they've come to the conclusion somewhere that old folks get treated better here, which is actually true in some cases, but it's generally old folks that are part of the system here. So what you find, especially with the part-timers and the retirees, these are, as with first duty military, these tend to not be particularly happy groups here. They tend to be pretty vocal about their unhappiness, and they tend to see Hawaii as a very, very racist place. So what you find is very different perceptions of who we are from different points of view, all within the concept of the group that would be considered haole. And that's probably one of the most confusing aspects of this group is one, they're not a group. And second, their views of Hawaii tend to be very clustered within a particular group, say, part-time residents, but they don't tend to be comprehensive of the group across the board. This makes them radically different than the other groups we're going to see from now on. The other groups we're going to see from now on are pretty much one or maybe two packages within a particular culture ethnic group. Chinese, for example, there's the older Chinese that arrived here 150 years ago. There's the new Chinese that arrived in the last 20 years. Filipinos, there's the population that arrived here between 1920 and 1930, and there's a group that's come in here in the last 20 or 30 years. Very, very different groups. So within that context, what you find is the values and attitudes will be consistent. What varies is is the time history of arrival. The thing with all these groups is they're here now. They're here at the same time. But they've got very, very different views of us and very different views of the place of Hawaii. And about the only thing they carry in common for a lot of these groups is a common acceptance of the stereotypes of Hawaii, which is part of the baggage that they carry when they're dealing with the population here. Okay. So the key thing with this group, in the sense of Hawai'i, is, especially, and by here we go back to the Kama'aina, is that they're responsible for the plantations. It's the Kama'aina elites that are trying to basically make money. Remember, that's a huge Calvinist virtue. And they're the ones that realize that as the Hawaiian population is either being forced off the land because they can't pay, they lost land in the Mahele, or they can't afford to, they're just not engaged in the American revenue system, or the sort of Hawaiian monarchy American revenue system. So what happens is they're the group that takes advantage of that and basically realizes that you can convert the land property of the Hawaiian Islands into agribusiness. And you have to remember, plantation systems are radically different than farming. Farming and plantations don't really have much in common. Plantations can be seen as basically factories. There's not a lot of difference between a Foxconn factory that makes iPhones for Apple and a sugar plantation. Both see the real estate as simply a way to generate revenue. The only difference is one, you're generating revenue by growing plants. The other one, you're generating revenue by virtue of putting things together in a factory on a piece of real estate. So plantations are very specifically tied to the idea that you take plants and you convert them to cash. And you do that through growing the plant and processing it. If it's coffee, you go and you take the beans off the tree and you roast the beans and sell. If it's mac nuts, you take the nuts, crack them, and you eat them. You're selling. If it's pineapple, you cut it and you sell it. If it's sugar, you cut it, process it, turn it to sugar and sell it. So the plantation system is always the same, regardless of where you find it on the planet. They're basically taking some sort of a plant product. In fact, there's not a lot of difference between plantations and ranches. There's sort of different versions of the same thing. The landscape is the venue by which you generate the money. But what this means is you see the landscape as basically a form of revenue. So you judge the land on a plantation by virtue of the amount of sugar you can grow on it. The more valuable land, you sell it for more if you're going to sell your plantation. So you no longer look at it one as subsistence. So you're no longer growing food to feed people. You're not even growing food to sell it. You're growing plants to sell them. So in a traditional system, you'd be for Palolo, for example, you grow sweet potatoes, yams, dalo in the wet fields there, and you eat the majority of it, the population in this area, and then you sell your surplus. In a modern system, what you do is you grow stuff in Palolo, either sweet potatoes or maybe in the back, there's probably still guys, I'm sure there's guys still growing pakalolo, for example, back there. And what you do is pakalolo is not a good subsistence crop because you tend to get a bad case of the munchies. So Palolo, so pakalolo is going to be something you only use it to sell it. With that money, you then go down to food land or something, you buy what you're going to eat. So plantation systems are very straightforward. Because they're heavily involved with this idea of consumerism and the money and the power of money, Hawaiians in general, right from the get-go, never got involved in plantations. I can only think of one chief that actually had a plantation in the 1850s, and that was some chief on the Big Island, and by 5 years later he sells it to the Lymans, I think. And so you find that the chiefs that had large amounts of property here, though they could have, and in many cases their property was suitable for it. God knows the bishop, Bishop Estate had a gazillion acres, which would be good for plantations. They just don't seem to do that. In contrast to the Campbells, Castles, Cooks, and etc. Your Kama'aina families who immediately jump on this, and this becomes the revenue stream that they pursue right into the 1950s, 1960s. So the plantation system did several things. One is it became one of the ways the Hawaiian community disconnects from the land. Because in the plantation system, you have large, these are volume propositions. You need a lot of acres to make money off of sugar. And so you're going to basically very aggressively make sure that no one else is using land if you can make money off of it. So you start to coalesce areas into large pieces of property, and you chase out the small landowners or buy them out. So the Hawaiian community in general gets disconnected from the system. Secondly, is the plantation system is very labor intensive, and it has to be cheap labor. This is still very true today. If you go to the Big Island, you find, or for example, any of the islands, you find that if there's a huge demand for people to pick coffee when the coffee becomes ripe, which for some reason I think is in August, I can never remember. And generally they actually import folks from Guatemala or Honduras who come here on 6-month work permits and go from farm to farm and pick all the coffee and then go back to Guatemala or someplace like that, because they're willing to work for a lot cheaper than the local population is willing to do it. This is true on the mainland. If you buy fruit grown on the U.S. mainland, I can guarantee it was picked with labor who is non-American. They're from somewhere else. So what you find is the plantation system had an enormous demand for cheap labor. Now, by the 1850s, 1860s, there is no cheap labor here. The Hawaiian population is shrinking rapidly, combination of disease, outmigration, all the rest of these things, and also because the Hawaiian population that's around doesn't want anything to do with the system. So they're going to move to places like Makaha or Puna and the Big Island or Hana and Maui for the purpose of getting away from this plantation system and the job demands, because they just don't see it as being part of the world that they want to be a part of. So in that context, what happens, the plantations are desperate for cheap labor. It's the plantation system that drives many of your ancestors to arrive here. If you're Japanese, if you're Chinese, if you're Norwegian, if you're Swedish, if you're German, if you're Russian, if you're Ilocos or Tagalog or Okinawan or Korean, all those populations are originally brought over here in varying numbers by plantations who are desperate for cheap labor and really went shopping around planet Earth to find people who are willing enough and gullible enough in many cases to actually come to Hawaii and work for almost nothing, so that the plantation owners could become wealthy. So that's that process. In doing so, the plantations were totally disinterested in where you're from. They were totally disinterested in your culture, your cultural values. The plantations were a system of forced assimilation, very much like a military boot camp. So what you find, for example, in Maui, where I'm most familiar with, is you find many of the camps that the Alexander and Baldwin, Maui Land and Pine usually called, set up in central Maui, were combined Japanese and Okinawan camps. Now, if you know anything about Japanese and Okinawans, and if you don't, we'll get into it later, those two groups can't stand each other for a whole mess of historic and cultural reasons. They're two entirely separate populations. The plantation didn't give rat's ass. They'd hired folks from both those places. They put them in the same camp. They'd have to share the same bath. They'd have to live in the same dorm rooms together. And the plantation wouldn't tolerate some Japanese guy comes and says, well, I can't live next to him and sit next to him. I can't eat with him. He's Okinawan. The plantation's just going to look at him, dude, like, why do you think you're in charge? No, we hired your butt. You work for us. You're just going to suck up and deal with this because this is the way the world is. So the plantation system forced people to assimilate. They didn't care what you were. They were going to tell you what you are. In that period of time that people spent here on the plantations became absolutely central to making people adjust to life in Hawaii. In that process, they learned what the technical term is pidgin, the Creole language that was used on the plantations, which varies from island to island, by the way. They learned how to interact with other groups that they don't like. You don't have to like someone to be able to interact with them. And basically forced people to accept a world of diversity when none of those groups grew up in that. If you were China from Guangdong province, in the Chinese from Guangdong province in the 1870s, you never dealt with anyone other than you, folks like you. So you weren't used to diversity. If you were Japanese from Hiroshima region, where a lot of the folks came here from, you again had absolutely no experience with it other than Japanese. So finding yourself in a place where you have to deal with folks who talk a different language, act totally differently, look totally differently. And you have to learn how to live with them and accept them, or or just have to. That was what the plantations did. The plantations forced the workforce to adjust to everyone else in the workforce. And in part, that defines what eventually becomes the group that becomes called local. Is the group that learned and had to adjust to life on the plantation in a world of diversity, when none of them had a life experience which had that prior to that. So the plantations did it. Now, the plantations didn't do it for some, sterlingly good social reason. They simply did it because they were in the business of making money. And people gave all sorts of attitude and said, well, I need to live in a separate place. I can't live with Okinawans. The plantation isn't going to put out the money to go build a separate set of dorms for Japanese and keep segregated from Okinawans. They're just going to tell them, suck wind and just deal with it. And if they persist in it, they'll just whip them and they'll put them in solitary confinement for a day or two until they, quote, grow up and realize this is the way the world works. Another key part, and I'd sort of mentioned this before, from the 1870s on, the vast majority of products that were grown here, whether it be sugar, pineapple, coffee, whatever it is sold through San Francisco. So the Hawaii West Coast or the Hawaii California economic relationship, to a lesser extent Hawaii Seattle, were the two sort of huge economic systems that ran places. So if you were a plantation owner here and you needed money, you would generally go to a San Francisco bank for investment. If you were a San Francisco, person selling coffee and you needed more coffee, you'd contact one of the Hawaii coffee growers in the 1880s. So what you find is the two places as California grew in enormous amounts of power, wealth, and resources and population, Hawaii's plantation industry grew to reflect providing a resource. So in many ways, it was almost a supplement to the agricultural zones in areas around California. It just happened to be 2,400 miles away by water in a separate country. So those economic relationships are hugely critical. It's that economic relationship that actually drives the overthrow. By the 1890s, the economic relationship between San Francisco and Hawaii is so strong that any threat to that relationship would basically cause staggering amounts of bankruptcy here for almost all the plantations, because that's where they sold all the crops. What do you do with sugar if you can't sell it? What do you do with pineapple if you can't sell it? So when in 1889 or whatever it is, when the US government declares that the favored status with Hawaii is now gone, and that if you're a Hawaii farmer, you're going to have to pay, tariffs and all sorts of different costs because they don't want you competing with American farmers, then all of a sudden the Hawaii plantations end up seeing disaster on the wall. And the end result is what they do is they overthrow the government to become part of the United States purely to save their money. They don't do it for political reasons. No one's that pissed off at the Queen. She's not a particularly good monarch as far as the plantations are concerned. She keeps on talking about giving Hawaiians back more control and stuff like that. But that argument had been going on for 40 or 50 years. But the reality is the U.S. government, Congress, basically breaches the treaty that Hawaii had called the Reciprocity Treaty, which said that if you were growing stuff in Hawaii and selling it in the mainland United States, you didn't have to pay tariffs. You were considered the same as an American grower. From pressure from American farming lobbies, especially in California, but also the Midwest, they revoked that. And so all of a sudden in 1890, 1891, these guys are looking at disaster. And the end result is they decide the only way to make this change is to actually make Hawaii part of the United States, so they no longer are a foreign country, at which point then they can sell their products in the United States again. So a weird part of the overthrow of the monarchy is actually done for investment reasons, for cash reasons. It wasn't done for morality, even politics in the sense of, different types of political governance. No, it was a money thing. And it's sort of sad when you think about it. Ironically, what then happens is their timing's lousy and they can't do it till 1898, 1899. At which point they'd found, ironically, new markets for a lot of their products, and they're a lot more ambivalent about being in the United States, because now all of a sudden they realize, well, being part of the United States is actually sort of an iffy proposition, as we've seen. So they're not really so, thrilled by it. And one of the reasons they're not that thrilled by it is because the plantation labor here was actually handled worse than it was in the U.S. So when they become part of the United States as a territory, they suddenly have to up the ante of what they pay their workforce and how they treat the workforce vis-a-vis what they could do in the 1880s, 1890s. So the plantations really didn't do particularly well out of becoming a territory. They were the ones that pushed it. They were the ones that wanted it. But sort of ironically, when they got it, they realized it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. And I'm not sure why they didn't figure that out, but human nature being what it is, it's what happened. So sadly to see the monarchy gets overthrown because of U.S. Congress. Not because Congress does anything to Hawaii, but U.S. Congress says Hawaii is now a foreign country. And, selling stuff in the United States, you're now a foreign power, just like China or someplace else would be in, say, 2020. So in that case, these guys just go, can't live with that. And we're not going to sell our plantations and suddenly be poor. So change the system. And that whole sort of profit motive becomes pretty much a part of the history of the territory for the next, 60 years. Hawaii's sort of an odd place. On one hand, the way that we portray ourselves and the way that we're portrayed in the tourism industry is based on social values and attitudes and all sorts of stuff like that. But the reality, we certainly see in tourism, especially with discussing starting tourism up in a couple of weeks, is we're really very much a business cash on the barrel place. Morality and stuff is almost invariably couched within, can we afford it? What's the price of it? Very rarely is morality allowed a front or center stage. This is the right thing to do. And that's very much part of our plantation heritage from the late half of the 19th century right into 1950, basically. Notice how also with this, if you look at this whole idea of agribusiness, and that's this idea of plantations as a factory type thing. Notice how for Calvinists, there's sort of two interesting parts of this. Calvinist morality is very big on making money. So therefore acquiring property semi-legally, but making money off of it automatically makes it a moral thing, because making the money, being successful is the main morality push in the Calvinist view. So making a profit is actually good for Calvinists. This is different than a lot of the other mainstream groups in American society, where profit is much more sort of ambivalent as a motive. Calvinists are totally cool with that. The profit is what it's at. So the plantations are pretty much, they become the big dogs here in the late 1800s, because if they're making lots of money, they've got a beautiful house, one of the biggest estates, for example, like the Cook Estate and Wilcox Estates here in New Wanu, or the huge houses that they build in places like Portlock now. Those are definitely a good thing, because they are showing the fact that you're a hard worker, that you're very clever, that you're smart, you're aggressive, and you're a go-to get-ahead type person. On the other hand, because the Calvinists here are very explicitly purely Calvinist, they're not folks that just learn this as part of an educational system, they don't realize it. These are groups that actually know they're Congregationalists. They still go to Congregationalist churches. They're going back to New England to visit Congregationalist families. They see themselves in that sort of social moral ethos that we went through that other set of panels. In that situation, the workforce that they've got on the plantations, the folks that they brought over here to work as laborers, they feel a need to actually get involved in giving those folks the same opportunities, the way they see it, as they gave the Hawaiians when their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents came over here in the 1820s and 30s and brought literacy and Western education to the Hawaiian population. So one of the vastly different things you see with plantations here versus plantations almost anywhere else on the earth, who were not Calvinist, of course, the plantations in Jamaica, for example, or anywhere in the Caribbean or Latin America or Asia, is the plantation owners here spend a lot of time and money bugging their workforce. So among other things, one of the classic would be Pais. It's still pretty well laid out. And also actually the Punene Mill, which closed recently. You'll find that there's playing fields there. There's basketball courts. They funded schools. In many cases, it'd be a clinic around there. They would have training at night or during the weekends for their workforce that they can do. Because remember, the Calvinists were really big that you shouldn't be allowed to be idle and lazy. Never mind the fact these folks were busting ass 6 days a week. To the Calvinists, there was a seventh day there. And in the Calvinist view, of course, going to church wasn't really the best way to use the seventh day. The best way to use the seventh day was to find something to do on your day off and do something useful, something practical and useful that may allow you to make money and get ahead. So they spend some huge substantial amount of money in developing sports facilities, or athletic facilities more accurately, schools and all sorts of stuff to educate their workforce and give them a chance to become Calvinist. It generally doesn't work, but it's really interesting when you look at the different parts of the different islands, the number of gymnasiums, for example, and places like that, you see that originally were built for the plantations or by the plantations back whenever, that now are in many cases getting really old, that were part of this whole process that, unlike other parts of the world, you didn't let the workforce just sort of veg out when it was their time off. Here, the time off was supposed to be developed for self-improvement, which of course is a classic Calvinist virtue. So the relationship with the workforce was really odd compared to what you find elsewhere. And that probably is a good place to stop, because I'll get into the rest of this next time. Went through a lot. Did I lose everyone on this one, or are we all sort of hanging out together here?
I think we got it.
Okay. Again, if you haven't already, in fact, I haven't seen notes from anyone. Try to make sure you talk to the other folks working on your part of the Palolo project and figure out exactly what you guys are going to do, what parts each are going to take on. And then let me know so I can then get you guys actually going on the project, since we're now looking at first week in October. So definitely check with the rest of your folks first. I'm not going to chase everyone down in a group and ask them again. I figure that's your guys' kuleana. So do check with the rest of your party members, you might say. I guess that's it from my standpoint. Oh yeah, I didn't do that in this class. I'll be sending you some videos. No, strike that. I'm gonna actually, I should have done these before. I just realized I vegged out last week and didn't do them. Thursday, I'm gonna spend a few minutes showing you some partial videos that sort of go back to these reinforcing of Hawaiian stereotypes. Because I think, again, when you're talking about folks like the retirees and other folks, it's important to understand how powerful those stereotypes were and how ingrained and embedded they were, even by, say, the 1930s. So we'll see a little bit of those. Because I didn't show you the tap dancing hula, right?
No.
No.
Hey, don't give me the attitude. Trust me, you'll like it. I'm still convinced. I got to talk to a couple of folks that are judges at Mary Monarch and tell them they need this added to the Awana section of Mary Monarch next year. It's tap dancing hula. Anyways, okay, if we're all good then, I guess that's it.